I remember the exact moment my life started to revolve around the idea of weddings. It was when I was 9 years old, seated at our old kitchen table with its chipped edges and the persistent squeak in one of the wooden chairs. My mother was flipping through an enormous photo album, pointing out pictures from her own wedding to my father, and I was entranced by the white gown, the flowers, and the idea of family coming together. I was so young that I couldn't read deeper into the guarded glances or notice how my father's smile never reached his eyes in those photographs. Back then, I just thought it was magical, a day devoted to love, where everyone was on their best behavior and every moment felt like a celebration. I decided I wanted something similar for myself one day, even though the fine details about love or lasting commitment were far too big for me to grasp. I just knew I wanted the sparkle and warmth of that day, the day that belonged to the bride and groom. Even in those moments, I sensed my little sister, Mia, was watching me, as she always did. She was 2 years younger and already had a startling way of commanding the room's attention. I was the older sibling, but it never felt that way. Mia was always the one who got the compliments, the head pats, the indulgences from my parents. It was subtle at first, extra candy on Halloween, an extra hug at bedtime, a new toy for no reason at all. But over time, as I grew into my teenage years, the dynamic became blatantly obvious. Mia could do no wrong. If she broke a rule, my parents made excuses for her. If she made a mess, they cleaned it up or gently guided her on how to fix it, never raising their voices. Whenever I messed up, punishment was immediate and always disproportionate to my perceived crime. An uneven distribution of affection settled into the bones of our household, and I resented it more than I ever dared to say out loud. Still, I held on to my dream of one day having a wedding that would rival the fairy tales. In high school, while Mia was starting to dominate the conversation at home, piano recitals, ballet performances, a budding social life, I stayed in the background, learning to keep quiet about my own dreams. I discovered a part-time job in a local diner, figuring it would be good to save money for the future. My parents had never explicitly promised me a big wedding or a college fund or anything of that sort, but I still had this unspoken hope. My parents were not rolling in money, but they did well enough. My father was an accountant with his own small practice. My mother was a part-time teacher who loved to brag about her little star Mia to all her colleagues. Sometimes I'd catch my mom in the hallway at school telling other teachers how Mia was so talented and sweet. Meanwhile, I was just, oh, and that's my other daughter. By the time I got to college, I felt half invisible. Yet, something interesting happened when I left home. I found myself thriving away from my family's skewed dynamic. I discovered my ambition and nurtured big plans for my life. I wouldn't settle for a second-hand existence behind Mia, and I would no longer search for approval from people who never gave it willingly. I realized I wanted to build a future of my own design. The wedding I'd once imagined became part of a broader vision of success, but it was still important to me. I wanted a day that would feel like a genuine celebration of love and self-respect, something I could share with someone who valued me for who I truly was. My childhood illusions would be replaced by a stronger, adult version of the dream, a day that truly belonged to me, not something my parents could manipulate or overshadow. I carried that mindset all the way through my time in college, where I met Nathan, the man who would become my fiancé. We didn't start out fairy tale perfect. He was quiet, introspective, and slow to reveal who he was under the surface. I was guarded, hesitant to trust, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. But there was an immediate spark that grew more tangible as we spent time together. We met through a shared psychology class. Ironically, the professor had us do a project analyzing familial relationships. Nathan and I ended up as partners, and we spent hours discussing things like sibling favoritism and the effects of parental behavior on children's self-esteem. I opened up more than I ever had with anyone, and so did he. I learned about his supportive parents, who'd always offered him emotional stability, even if they didn't have much money. He learned about my parents' uneven love for Mia and their lukewarm tolerance of me. Our project ended up being a lot more personal than the professor ever could have guessed. We spent 3 happy years together before he proposed. It was a balmy Saturday evening in late summer, and we were on a rooftop bar with some of our closest friends. The sunset painted the sky in purples and oranges as he took my hand, made a heartfelt speech about how much I'd grown and persevered, and then asked me to marry him. Tears welled up in my eyes the moment he got down on one knee. I said yes, of course. It felt like the definitive moment when I could claim my life and my happiness wholeheartedly without fear of being overshadowed. My friends cheered, hugging me, and I felt a profound sense of belonging and love, something I'd rarely experienced in my family. Little did I know that perfect evening would become the calm before the storm. Shortly after the proposal, my parents insisted I visit them back in my hometown. I'd moved to a city about 3 hours away, so I packed some bags, and Nathan and I made the drive. On the way, my stomach was twisted in knots. I kept remembering how my parents had treated me growing up, and I wondered if they would hijack my wedding in favor of Mia's future wedding, or find a way to shame me about my plans. But I was determined to keep a calm front. I was an adult now, and I had a right to create the life I wanted. Once we arrived, my parents offered lukewarm congratulations, while Mia practically squealed with delight, hugging me a bit too tightly. She kept glancing at my ring with equal parts envy and excitement. My father shook Nathan's hand, my mother made some comment about how the ring was lovely, but that I needed to consider a simpler wedding so we weren't excessive. When I shared my initial ideas about wanting a modest but meaningful ceremony with about 100 guests, my parents nodded. Nathan spoke up about us planning to cover most of the expenses ourselves, but my father insisted they wanted to contribute. "It's your wedding," he said. "Let us at least help with something." My mother agreed, adding that she and my father had put aside some money over the years, hoping I'd use it for something special, like a wedding or a down payment on a house. I was genuinely touched, even if I had my misgivings. Maybe this was the moment of reconciliation, I thought. Perhaps all the old resentments would finally fade, replaced by a new phase of mutual respect. My parents had never shown real generosity for me before, but they sounded genuine. I decided to trust them, ignoring the faint alarm bells ringing in my head. Nathan and I returned home with renewed optimism. We began looking at venues, emailing caterers, and sampling wedding cakes. We were determined not to blow our budget, but we wanted a day that would be memorable for us and for our guests. We set aside every extra dollar we could manage into a separate savings account, our wedding fund. Nathan's parents offered to pitch in whatever they could, and we graciously accepted, though we knew it wouldn't be a large sum. Then my parents told me they wanted to contribute $15,000, an amount that made me gasp. It felt huge, especially considering their previous disinterest in my life. My father claimed it was money they'd been saving slowly since I was a kid, always intending it to be for my wedding day. Part of me was suspicious. Why would they have been so tight with me through my adolescence if they had this fund? But I decided to take it as a gesture of good faith. 1 month before the wedding, as we were finalizing vendor contracts, I got a phone call from my mother at 4 in the morning. She was sobbing uncontrollably, claiming my father had collapsed. The doctors supposedly found a mass in his stomach that could be cancer. I'd never heard her so distressed. So, the next morning, I dropped everything and drove to my parents' house. Mia was there, wearing pajamas and looking teary-eyed, and she said my father was undergoing tests. My mother pulled me aside, her face streaked with tears, and whispered that they didn't have enough insurance coverage and needed money right away for some immediate procedures. The number she gave me was close to $15,000. My heart dropped. I asked if the tests were absolutely necessary, or if we could seek a second opinion or a payment plan. My mother gave me the sternest look and said time was of the essence, insinuating that my father could die if I hesitated. I didn't know what to do, but Mia was crying quietly in the background and the whole atmosphere was pure chaos. My only thought was, I can't let my father die just so I can have a dream wedding. My mother kept insisting that they'd pay me back, but if I didn't give them the cash, they'd have to wait for insurance approvals, which could take weeks or months. Without questioning too deeply, I allowed myself to be carried away by fear and love. I transferred the entire $15,000 from my wedding fund. My mother embraced me with a dramatic thank you, tearful and trembling, telling me I was saving my father's life. It was the darkest moment in my memory, but I believed it was the right decision. When I told Nathan later that day, he was alarmed by the suddenness of it all, but he believed my father's life was the priority too. We felt momentarily panicked about how to salvage the wedding plan, but we reassured each other that we could find a new solution. Maybe we'd scale back or push the date further out until we recouped the funds. The important thing was that my father got better. Over the next few days, the details got muddy. My mother stopped responding to calls for updates. Mia claimed she was at the hospital all the time, but I couldn't get any direct information. Eventually, Mia told me the crisis had passed and my father was recovering at home. She said, "It's a miracle. The doctors took care of it quickly." Something in her voice felt off, like she was holding back laughter or excitement that didn't match the gravity of the situation. I decided to visit, but my parents insisted it wasn't the right time, that my father was resting and didn't want visitors. My concern turned to suspicion. Why wouldn't they let me see him? I texted Mia for more details, but she only responded with vague reassurances, saying, "He's healing, just trust us." Then, the truth slipped out in the most humiliating fashion. A friend of mine who still lived in my hometown sent me a link to Mia's social media account. Mia had posted pictures from the hospital, but it wasn't a hospital room in the photos. It looked more like a resort suite. The captions, filled with inside jokes and little heart emojis, described how she was celebrating a honeymoon preview with her boyfriend, of all people. Not just a weekend getaway. No, the pictures showed them at a luxury spa, toasting with champagne, wearing plush robes with ocean views in the background. My friend typed, "Hope everything's okay with your dad, but these pics look suspicious." Shockwaves coursed through me. The next few hours were a haze. I paced the living room, replaying every detail of what my mother had said, the hysterical phone calls, the tears, the talk of insurance issues. It must have all been a ruse. My father wasn't sick at all. They had crafted a crisis to con me out of the wedding money. $15,000 down the drain to pay for Mia's lavish honeymoon or some exclusive weekend. My fury blazed so hot I felt like I might pass out. The betrayal was so beyond anything I could have imagined, it made my head spin. I confronted them that night. My mother picked up the phone with a casual, "Hello, dear," as if nothing had happened. I demanded to know where my father really was, and she stammered. She tried to maintain the story, claiming he was still frail, but I screamed that I knew the truth. There was a long silence, and then my father got on the line, calmly saying, "We needed to do what was necessary for the family." I wanted to jump through the phone line. "You stole my wedding money for Mia's honeymoon?" I shrieked, my voice echoing in my own ears. He admitted it, with maddening calmness, adding that Mia deserved something special, because she was under so much stress planning her future with her boyfriend. According to him, "You'll understand when you have your own kids. Sometimes you have to sacrifice for the child who needs it more." I felt the last shred of respect I'd had for them snap like a brittle twig. There was no apology, no remorse. They had fabricated a life-threatening illness, emotionally manipulated me, and stolen a large chunk of my savings, all to bankroll Mia's indulgences. And there was zero shame in their voices, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, I realized there could be no forgiveness. Their betrayal had cut too deep. I ended the call by telling them I never wanted to speak to them again. My father tried to protest, but I hung up. I wasn't sure I could even cry anymore. I was just hollow and enraged. Nathan was furious on my behalf, but he was also deeply worried for me. "Let's just move on," he said. "We can still get married, do a small ceremony at the courthouse if we have to." He held me close while I trembled with anger. But a small spark of resolve lit within me, a determination to not let them get away with this. My parents didn't just steal money, they trampled my trust and all sense of dignity. I was done being the family doormat who quietly accepted every injustice. If they thought they had outsmarted me, they were wrong. I decided, right then and there, that there would be no tears of forgiveness or attempts at reconciliation. There would be only revenge, methodical, calculated, and satisfying. The first step in my plan was gathering information. I reached out to every relative I trusted, every mutual friend, quietly telling them the basics. My parents stole my wedding fund for Mia's honeymoon, lied about it, and scammed me. I'm furious, but please don't let them know I'm telling you this. I just want to know if they've said anything to you. The results were staggering. My parents had told different family members different lies. To some, they claimed I had given them the money because Mia was in a life or death crisis. To others, they insisted I was so wealthy that I was just handing out large sums. Each story had the same goal, to cover their tracks and keep Mia looking like the golden girl. I made sure to keep quiet on social media. I didn't want to give them any reason to suspect I was plotting something. In fact, I played my usual role of the invisible daughter, posting nothing significant, staying off the radar. Meanwhile, I researched the best ways to have a discreet wedding. Could we get married without my parents knowing a thing? Absolutely, if we kept it private and limited to people we trusted. But I wanted something more than just secrecy. I wanted to watch my parents squirm. I wanted to ensure that this time, they were the ones left out in the cold, clueless, and powerless. The second step was to recollect funds for a wedding, but do it in such a way that my parents wouldn't suspect a thing. I'd gotten a decent promotion at work, and Nathan had some savings put away, plus his parents said they'd contribute what they could. We decided we'd keep our official wedding date, but we'd move all the details to a new venue, and we'd do everything under a different name if possible. We found a small vineyard about 45 minutes away that offered packages for private events, letting the couple put down a refundable deposit under an alias if they needed to. They were used to hosting celebrity weddings that needed absolute discretion. It was costly, but we wanted to invest in secrecy now. We used Nathan's cousin's name for all initial contracts, so if my parents ever tried to check, they'd find nothing under mine or Nathan's names. Once I had the venue locked in, I orchestrated a deliberate misdirection. I informed my parents, via an email that had minimal emotion, that we had decided to postpone the wedding indefinitely due to financial constraints and personal issues. I pretended I was too devastated to talk about it further. My father wrote back something smug, basically implying that I needed to learn to manage my money better. My mother sent me a barrage of messages, half concerned, half smug, saying, "I hope you're not angry with us for using the wedding money for Mia. We know you understand how important her happiness is." I didn't reply. I just let them think they'd won. Meanwhile, Mia posted pictures of her new engagement ring and teased an upcoming destination wedding. She'd become officially engaged to her boyfriend, apparently flush with the money that should have been mine. Each post was like a stab to the gut, but it fueled my determination. 6 months passed. During that time, I threw myself into planning a secret wedding that would be everything I'd ever wanted. Nathan and I quietly upgraded the ring, choosing a design I loved without input from my parents. We picked out floral arrangements, a caterer, even a local band to play at the reception. We invited only those friends and family we fully trusted, people who either knew the real story or were at least supportive enough not to cause trouble. My mother's siblings sided with me. They had suspected for a long time that my parents had favored Mia. They were discreet, though, which I appreciated. Nathan's family was entirely on board, too. They made sure we felt surrounded by love, especially on days when the betrayal still stung like an open wound. The day of the wedding arrived, a crisp autumn afternoon where the leaves shimmered gold and red on the hillside beyond the vineyard. The ceremony was set outdoors, near the vines, with a gentle breeze that rustled everyone's hair in a soothing way. I wore an elegant white dress, lace detailing at the sleeves, my hair in loose waves pinned back by delicate flowers. Nathan stood at the altar, looking both dashing and emotional in a tailored navy suit. As the music began and I made my way down the aisle, every nerve in my body hummed with a mixture of triumph, happiness, and a lingering sense of disbelief that I was actually pulling this off. This was my wedding, the one I had fought for with every ounce of determination. And my parents, those who'd taken me for a fool, were nowhere in sight. We exchanged vows that we'd written ourselves, speaking softly but clearly about the love we had nurtured through adversity, about how we'd always stand by each other's side, no matter what challenges arose. There wasn't a dry eye in the small gathering of about 60 people. Then we said, "I do," and we kissed. The relief that flooded me was profound. This was the moment of reclaiming my life. I felt unstoppable. The man I loved became my husband, and I'd done it without my parents' interference. We walked down the aisle as a married couple, greeted by our cheering guests tossing flower petals in the air. The sensation of freedom was indescribable. But the sweetest part of it all was yet to come. After the ceremony, we had arranged for a private dinner on the vineyard's terrace. Candles flickered on the tables, wine flowed, and the band played gently in the background. Halfway through, I stood up to make a toast. I looked around the room, scanning the faces of aunts, uncles, cousins, and close friends, feeling gratitude that they'd supported me in secrecy and shared my special day. "I want to thank everyone here for being part of this moment," I began. "You all know what it took for Nathan and me to arrive at this point, and I'm so proud to say we did it on our own terms. Everyone applauded. Nathan smiled at me with pride. Then, I dropped the final bombshell. I'd hired a videographer to compile a montage of phone messages, texts, and direct confessions from my parents, showing how they'd lied about the medical emergency, stolen the money, and confessed it was for Mia's honeymoon. It was a risky move. Some might say it was in poor taste to show such negativity at a wedding, but I needed catharsis. This was the moment I could finally stand up for my truth in front of the people who mattered. The room went silent as the video played on a projector screen. My father's voice came through the speaker, saying in a dismissive tone, "We had to take the money for Mia, or else how would she have afforded her dream trip? We know that's your wedding money, but she's the one who deserves it. You'll understand someday." My mother's sob story about the supposed medical crisis played next, and it was eerie to watch it unfold with knowledge of the truth. My wedding guests looked on in shock, some outraged, others shaking their heads with pity for me. At the end of the presentation, I lifted my champagne flute. This was the reality I grew up with, and this is what Nathan and I overcame. We want all of you to know we'll never bow down to liars and thieves, and I vow to ensure that those who have wronged us never see a dime of our money or a moment of our sympathy again. Everyone erupted into applause. Through tears, my aunts and uncles stood and clapped the loudest, while Nathan squeezed my hand, whispering how proud he was of me. It felt like reclaiming the narrative of my life in a single, powerful moment. The fallout was immediate. My parents had no clue about the wedding day until they started getting calls from relatives who had witnessed the video. Some relatives were furious with them for the deception and cruelty. Others just cut them off entirely, sick of the manipulation. Mia, of course, tried to spin the story, claiming I was unhinged for airing dirty laundry in public. But no one was buying it. My mother sent me a series of frantic text messages. "How could you do this to us? You humiliated us." My father tried to call, insisting that I take the video down from any recordings, but I was done entertaining their nonsense. I had the satisfaction of knowing that the entire extended family saw them for who they truly were. Over the next weeks, I learned that my parents' finances took a severe hit. They had borrowed against some lines of credit to pay for Mia's honeymoon, assuming they might recoup the money from me eventually. With their reputation in tatters, none of the extended family wanted to bail them out. My father lost a few clients who heard about the scandal and didn't trust him with their taxes anymore. Mia and her fiancé suddenly found themselves footing more bills than expected, and it dawned on them that the gravy train of parental favors might be nearing an end. The schadenfreude was intense, but I won't apologize for it. They'd brought it all upon themselves. They had no moral high ground from which to complain. Nathan and I settled into our new life as husband and wife, free from the toxic cloud of my parents' manipulation. I blocked their numbers and their social media accounts. When Mia tried to email me to patch things up, claiming she was just a pawn in our parents' plan, I deleted her messages without reading them fully. I saw the pictures of her fancy honeymoon. She didn't look like someone being forced into anything. She looked happy, smug, and fully complicit. So no, there would be no forgiveness from me. My sense of self-respect was finally too strong to allow them back into my life. If they thought they could wave a half-hearted apology in front of me and I'd cave, they were sorely mistaken. Months passed, and eventually, rumors spread that Mia and her fiancé had broken up. Something about money disputes and stress. It was a petty thrill to learn that everything they'd stolen from me had failed to secure their happiness. My parents, on the other hand, continued spiraling downward. I got occasional updates from relatives. They were trying to refinance their home, my father was losing more clients, my mother was pleading with relatives for small loans. Every time, I felt a vindictive stab of satisfaction, knowing I didn't have to do anything but watch them destroy themselves. No more guilt, no more second chances. I had found my sweet revenge simply by living well and exposing their betrayal. Nathan and I invested in a cozy townhouse. We turned it into a home filled with laughter, mutual respect, and honesty. We hosted dinner parties for friends, curated a modest art collection, and even began talking about starting a family, on our own terms, with love and integrity. When I got pregnant 2 years after our secret wedding, I kept that information away from my parents. My child deserved better than to have them around. My father tried to contact me once more, claiming he'd heard the wonderful news from an aunt, but I never returned his calls. He left a voicemail, sounding oddly penitent for once. Still, my mind was unshakable. They would never be welcome in my life again, nor in my child's. At some point, they must have realized I was gone for good. Mia texted me under a new phone number to say she missed her niece or nephew, even though the baby wasn't born yet. She was clearly fishing for information. I blocked the number. The old me would have felt pangs of guilt or sorrow at the loss of a sisterly bond. But after what they did, those pangs were absent. My mental health soared when I accepted that loyalty needs to be earned and maintained, not presumed just because of blood ties. Even though years have passed now, I still sometimes recall how deeply that betrayal cut me. A fleeting memory will surface. My parents' voices begging for money at 4 a.m, claiming my father was dying. My stomach will twist with disgust, remembering how I rushed to their side, never suspecting the magnitude of their cruelty. The difference is, those memories no longer control me. They're simply reminders of a life I left behind, a lesson I've learned far too well. Betrayal without remorse does not deserve forgiveness. It deserves a definitive goodbye. Every so often, people ask me whether I regret not making amends or whether I fear I'll be judged for disowning my parents. I respond that my door is shut only because they attempted to shatter my sense of self for so long. After the lengths they went to for Mia, after the money they stole, they never expressed true remorse. They treated me like a resource to be drained, not a daughter to be cherished. One can't build a relationship on such a foundation. If they ever show genuine accountability, like selling some possessions to pay me back or offering an earnest, unconditional apology, I might consider acknowledging them, but they'd have to move mountains to regain my trust. And based on their track record, I don't see that happening. I do wonder how Mia's life is now. I hear bits and pieces. She apparently moved back to our hometown after her relationship imploded, leaning even harder on my parents for support. From what I'm told, it's a sad cycle, with them all complaining about financial woes while pointing fingers at each other. It's a far cry from the lavish lifestyle they tried to establish with my stolen money. There's no satisfaction for them at the end of that tunnel. Sometimes I think about how the entire fiasco could have been avoided if they had just respected me enough to let me keep the money I diligently saved. We could have stayed a family, albeit a complicated one, but instead, they orchestrated the biggest deceit of my life, and there are no do-overs for that. Nathan remains my rock through it all. He has never once suggested I should find it in my heart to forgive or forget. He recognizes that what they did was unforgivable by any normal standard. Rather than patching up that toxic relationship, we chose to build healthy ones with people who actually support us. When our daughter was born, she was surrounded by love from the family we chose. Our friends, Nathan's parents, and the relatives on my side who had always been decent. We had a small celebration for her arrival, reminiscent of our secret wedding. No stress, no lies, no manipulation, just love. As for the wedding, I sometimes replay the highlight reel in my mind. The sunlit vineyard, the trembling in Nathan's voice when he said his vows, the hush that fell over the crowd when I unveiled the truth about my parents' betrayal. It still feels surreal that I managed to pull off such a triumphant day under the cloak of secrecy. But I had to do it. It was the only way to reclaim my agency, to stand up for myself in a family that had always dismissed me. Some people might say revenge is petty or that carrying grudges does more harm than good. In my case, exposing the truth and holding them accountable set me free. I didn't hurt them physically. I simply revealed what they'd done. Their fall from grace was their own doing. If there's one lesson I'd share with anyone who finds themselves in a similar predicament, it's this. You have every right to protect your peace. It doesn't matter if the people who betray you are your parents, siblings, or friends. No one has the right to demand you sacrifice your well-being while they continuously lie, cheat, and steal. Everyone deserves a chance to make things right, but when they show you who they are repeatedly, when they aren't sorry at all, believing them is not just an option, it's a necessity. We do not owe eternal loyalty to those who poison our lives. We owe it to ourselves to pursue love, happiness, and respect. My secret wedding was an extreme measure, but it was the grand finale of years of mistreatment. It wasn't just about the stolen money, it was about reclaiming my life from those who never valued me. Looking back, I can see that my parents' favoritism toward Mia was probably rooted in some twisted psychology, maybe guilt or personal insecurities, or a need to live vicariously through her. Whatever the reason, their choice was their own. They didn't have to let it tear our family apart, but they did, and now they're reaping the consequences. Do I feel bad for them? Sometimes, a tiny part of me mourns the parents I wish I'd had, but compassion doesn't equate to letting them off the hook. They can sit with what they've done. Maybe one day they'll realize that a loving family is built on honesty and fairness, not on deception and manipulation. By then, though, my door will have been closed for a very long time. Our wedding photos hang proudly in our living room. In them, you can see the sun illuminating the vines behind us, the soft glow that envelops our friends as they cheer, and the look of pure triumph on my face when I stand at Nathan's side. I still recall the exact temperature of the wind on my cheek, the faint scent of grapes ripening. It was a day that could have been overshadowed by heartbreak if I had let my parents sabotage me again. Instead, it turned into a beacon of all that I'd achieved despite them. I financed it myself, with the help of people who genuinely loved me, and it was more perfect than any wedding they might have tried to plan or meddle in. It was mine. Most important, that wedding cemented a new way of living for me. A life without the weight of my parents' judgments. A life where I don't measure my worth by how well I please them. And a life that holds no tolerance for betrayal or shallow gestures. Each anniversary with Nathan is a reminder that I made the right choice. That I saved not just my wedding day, but my entire future from the toxic influence of people who never deserved my trust. Our marriage is strong, not built on illusions, and we've grown together in ways that might never have been possible if I'd stayed under my parents' thumb. Sometimes I wonder if Mia ever regrets it. There must be moments, after her relationships crumble, or when she needs real emotional support, that she realizes what a genuine sister might have given her. Love that stands the test of time, advice rooted in sincerity, or just the comfort of sibling understanding. But she'll never get that from me now. She chose to be complicit in stealing my wedding funds, she posed on social media flaunting a luxurious life built on lies, and she never once tried to warn me or side with me. She might wake up one day in her empty bed and realize that no honeymoon in the world was worth selling out her sister. But that's her burden to carry. My burden lifted the day I said, "I do," at my secret wedding, and I refused to shoulder hers. People sometimes say, the best revenge is living well. In my experience, that's only partially correct. Living well is a powerful statement, but sometimes you also need to take decisive action to expose the wrongdoing. My parents' house of cards didn't just tumble by chance. I gave it a strategic push at the perfect moment. The satisfaction of watching them face the consequences is a feeling I won't deny. Yes, I'm living well, but I also demanded accountability. That combination let me truly close the chapter on their betrayal. There's no lingering sense of what if, or maybe I should have. I did exactly what was required to stand up for myself, and I have no regrets. Now, as I sit with my cup of tea, watching the sunrise through the window of our cozy townhouse, I feel a deep contentment. My daughter is asleep in the next room, Nathan will be home from work soon, and life is, dare I say it, peaceful. I never thought I'd find this kind of serenity. Growing up, my parents taught me the world was precarious, that love was conditional, that fairness was for the weak. I broke free from those lessons. I proved that even if your closest relatives betray you, it's possible to build a new definition of family, one that's built on trust and genuine affection. The cost was high, $15,000, tears shed, illusions shattered, but in the end, it was worth every penny to rid myself of their toxic hold and claim the life I deserve. I won't dwell on how different things might have been had they chosen honesty and fairness. Instead, I'll focus on what I gained, a clear sense of self, a marriage built on genuine connection, and a life that's immune to their manipulative games. They may think I'm cruel for not forgiving them, but self-preservation isn't cruelty, it's an act of love for oneself. And maybe that's what they never taught me, how to truly love and respect myself in the face of opposition. I had to learn it on my own, through heartbreak and rage, and I learned it well. So here I am, happily married, financially stable, and blessed with a daughter who will never know her grandparents or aunt. It's a choice I made with unwavering resolve, and it's the right choice. She will grow up surrounded by adults who respect her as an individual, who don't force her into favoritism or mind games. She will see me and Nathan standing side by side, not cowed by the weight of someone else's selfishness. And as she grows, I'll share with her the story of how her parents got married in secret, ensuring no one could sabotage that precious day. I'll teach her that family can be chosen, that trust is earned, and that nobody, even a parent, has the right to take away your dignity. My parents tried to sabotage me with one grand deception, but what they really did was set me free from their grasp forever. I used to want their approval, but now I see how small that desire was in comparison to what I've built for myself. My wedding wasn't just a union with Nathan. It was a declaration that I am no longer the naive girl who can be bullied or tricked into submission. I am a woman who discovered her strength and rose above the cruelty. And for me, that realization is the happiest ending I could ever have imagined, far more exhilarating and soul-healing than any apology they might one day dangle in front of me. I'm still the same person who once dreamed of a wedding filled with love and magic, but I'm also someone who recognizes that no dream is worth sacrificing your self-respect. My parents tried to tear me down. Instead, they inadvertently gave me the clarity I needed to build a life free of their hypocrisy. This is my story, and it ends on my terms, with a secret wedding, a perfect day, and the knowledge that I stood up for myself when it mattered most. No forgiveness, no open doors. Only peace and a future untainted by those who betrayed me. And I wouldn't have it any other way. After the day of my secret wedding, life settled into a gentle rhythm I'd never experienced growing up. The relief was immense. For the first time in my entire life, I felt unburdened by family drama. Nathan and I were free to shape our marriage and future without the icy grip of my parents' manipulation. In the hush of early mornings, I'd slip out of bed, brew coffee, and watch the sunrise filter through our living room window, calm in the knowledge that I'd reclaimed my independence. Still, echoes of my parents' betrayal sometimes intruded on my thoughts. I'd catch myself remembering their cunning deception, the late-night phone call, the frantic tears, the imaginary illness. The memory burned, but it also reminded me why I'd chosen to keep them out of my life. Mia's involvement in the ruse, her social media taunts, and her never-ending attempts to gather sympathy only deepened my resolve. I refused to share my new life with people who had so callously disregarded my well-being. Nathan, steadfast as ever, was my anchor. On weekends, we turned our attention to renovating our townhouse. We painted the bedroom walls a warm, dusty orange, hung shelves for our books, and rearranged furniture to create a cozy reading nook by the window. The space started to feel like a real home. Our wedding photos, capturing the secret vineyard ceremony, graced the mantel in simple black frames. I still smiled whenever I glanced at them, recalling the unwavering support from the relatives and friends who'd shown up despite the hush-hush nature of our plans. Their loyalty had transformed what could have been a tragedy into a triumphant reclamation of my happiness. Shortly after we settled, we received a slew of messages from well-meaning relatives, mostly on my mother's side, who had attended the wedding and witnessed the video montage that exposed my parents' lie. A few were appalled by my parents' brazenness, while others expressed relief that the truth was finally out. According to them, my parents were in turmoil, in debt, isolated from family support, and facing the reality that I was firmly out of their grasp. My father had apparently lost more accounting clients than I initially realized. Stories circulated of him calling old customers to beg for a second chance, only to be met with uncomfortable refusals or outright hang-ups. My mother, once the social butterfly, now stayed home and refused to show her face at teacher gatherings. She had tried to claim a family misunderstanding, but the video we'd shown at our wedding spoke louder than any denial she could concoct. I would be lying if I said I felt only pity or sadness. Part of me reveled in the poetic justice. The anger that had once consumed me had morphed into a kind of cold satisfaction tempered by the new warmth of my life with Nathan. I wasn't an inherently spiteful person, but I believed in letting consequences run their course. My parents had betrayed me in the most profound way possible, so whatever darkness befell them was on their own heads. Even so, I maintained distance from the ongoing drama, declining to respond to any family gossip. I told relatives, "I've said my piece," and left it at that. There was no need to keep rehashing the same pain. Mia, however, was a different story. She reached out a few times, sending me frantic emails and text messages through numbers I didn't recognize. Sometimes she sounded regretful, claiming she hadn't fully realized what our parents were doing until it was too late. Other times, she pivoted to anger, calling me petty and vindictive for what I'd shown at the wedding. She even tried to guilt trip me, saying I'd ruined her honeymoon because of the public humiliation she'd endured. I deleted each message. I told myself she was no more trustworthy than our parents, someone who saw me only as a means to her own comfort. If she missed any part of our sibling bond, it was likely just the convenience of having me around to bail her out or tolerate her behavior. The real me, strong, newly assertive, was of no interest to her. When I discovered I was pregnant, I felt a swirl of emotions. Joy and a touch of apprehension mingled in the pit of my stomach. I knew I wanted this child to have a life free from toxic family dynamics. Nathan cried happy tears when I told him. We embraced in our kitchen, a half-finished dinner on the stove, both of us laughing at how surreal it felt. I was going to be a mother, something my own parents had taught me to fear, but I intended to approach it differently, forging a relationship with my child based on unwavering love and genuine support. I knew it wouldn't be simple, but I was determined to break the cycle of favoritism that had plagued my childhood. The months that followed were a blur of prenatal appointments, reading baby books, and making cautious plans. We kept the pregnancy quiet from my side of the family for as long as we could, hoping to avoid my parents attempting to wedge themselves back into my life. Nathan's parents, on the other hand, were thrilled and fully supportive. They helped us with everything from researching the safest car seats to repainting the spare room a soothing shade of pale green for the baby. It was comforting to be enveloped in unconditional love, especially from a set of in-laws who genuinely saw me as part of their family. But secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks, even when you try your hardest to contain them. One of my mother's sisters, who'd been discreetly supportive but still kept in contact with my parents, accidentally let slip that I was expecting. Whether my aunt mentioned it to my mother or my father first, I never found out, but soon, I received an email from my mother's account with the subject line, "We're so happy for you." The message inside was filled with superficial warmth, bold proclamations about how excited they were to be grandparents and how they couldn't wait to meet the baby. Not a single word about the past, or about the money they'd stolen, or the deception they'd staged. It was as if they expected me to hand them a fresh start on a silver platter. My response was silence. I didn't block that address immediately. Some part of me wanted to see what else they might attempt. Over the next few weeks, I was bombarded with similar emails, each more desperate than the last. My father tried his hand at apologizing, though he focused more on how Mia needed the money and less on the gravity of the betrayal. My mother played the emotional angle, claiming she dreamed of knitting baby blankets and holding her grandchild. They both made light of what had happened, as though losing $15K was a minor inconvenience and not a major breach of trust. Meanwhile, Mia popped back up with a different tactic. "I can't believe they're doing this, trying to play grandma and grandpa after all they've done to you." She positioned herself as if she were on my side, yet her words rang hollow. She didn't apologize for her part, she only criticized our parents for going too far. Her messages contained hints that she wanted to reconnect. Some cryptic lines like, "We've both been victims, maybe we can figure this out together." But I saw right through it. Mia had been the golden child, the beneficiary of everything stolen from me. She never once tried to refuse that money or stand up for me. Now that she might lose the advantage, she wanted to realign. I wasn't falling for it. Even as I hardened my heart against them, the emotional whiplash of pregnancy made it difficult not to ponder. There were moments when hormones battered me, and I wondered if I was being too cruel, cutting off my parents from their future grandchild. Then I'd recall that phone call, my mother's hysterical sobs, and the subsequent photos of Mia on her luxurious trip. In my darkest hours, I'd feel anger swirl anew, as if the wound had just reopened. No, I wasn't being cruel. I was protecting my life and my baby's future. Forgiveness is something people earn by showing genuine remorse and taking real steps to mend the harm they've inflicted. My parents had done none of that. As the pregnancy progressed, we threw a baby shower in the backyard of Nathan's parents' house. It was a bright day in late spring, with friends and family gathered under a canopy of twinkle lights. Gifts piled up, tiny onesies, soft blankets, baby books with bedtime stories. We laughed and ate homemade pastries, cherishing the glow of impending parenthood. Nobody invited my parents or Mia. Some of my mother's siblings attended, carefully navigating the tension but showing unconditional support for me. One of my aunts took me aside, gently rubbing my belly, and whispered, "You've come so far. We're all proud of you, honey. Don't let anyone take your peace away." Her words lodged in my heart, reinforcing the knowledge that what I was doing, keeping them out, was the right call. About 2 weeks before my due date, a friend who worked for a local event planning company informed me that she'd seen my parents making inquiries for a family celebration. The date in question was only a few days after my due date, and the venue was oddly close to our home. My mind swirled with possibilities. Did they plan to ambush me? Were they booking a space with the hope of hosting a welcome baby party without my consent? I felt my pulse quicken. Nathan placed his hands on my shoulders and told me to breathe. "They can try anything," he reassured me, "but they have no power unless you let them in." He was right. I reminded myself that my parents had no legitimate claim to any special involvement in my life. If they wanted to waste money on a doomed event, that was on them. The day I went into labor, my father had the audacity to call my phone multiple times. I didn't notice at first. I was too busy wincing through contractions, clinging to Nathan's hand as we rushed to the hospital. By the time I checked my phone, we were already in the maternity ward, and my father's voicemail rambled about urgent family matters. I deleted it without listening to the rest. The labor itself was a blur of pain, breathlessness, and a kind of primal fear. But the moment my daughter arrived, everything in the world crystallized around her tiny cry. Nathan cut the cord, tears streaming down his face, and the nurse placed our daughter in my arms. My heart shattered in the best possible way, replaced by a love so fierce it made my head spin. Nothing could disrupt that moment, least of all the people who had abandoned any right to be part of my joy. In the hospital, I turned my phone off. For 2 days, we cocooned in that room, learning to nurse, resting, and gazing at our perfect little girl. We named her Eve. We posted a single announcement on social media, carefully controlling the privacy settings, so only our closest circle could see it. I refused to let my parents overshadow this precious time. When we brought Eve home, I felt the world tilt on its axis. Sleep became a luxury. My days and nights melted into feedings, diaper changes, and bleary-eyed wonder at the new life in my arms. But even in my sleep-deprived state, I carried a serene conviction. My parents would never step foot in her presence. Sure enough, once the news of Eve's birth spread, the barrage began again. My father insisted they only wanted to see their granddaughter once or twice, just for a few minutes. My mother sent me an email threatening to take legal steps if I tried to keep Eve away from them. That threat almost made me laugh. On what grounds could they possibly force me to let them see my baby? They had no legal standing, no prior relationship with her. They couldn't claim any kind of grandparents' rights, not in our state or under our circumstances. Their desperation stank of arrogance, a final attempt to browbeat me into submission. I blocked their emails again, shutting down their avenue of contact. Mia, in a baffling turn, left me a voicemail sobbing about how she wanted to be an aunt to Eve. Her voice cracked as she complained about the emptiness of her own life since her fiancé left her, about her regrets, about how she just wanted family. Her words were carefully chosen, pressing every emotional button she could. Under different circumstances, I might have felt sorry for her, but I had grown immune. She hadn't spoken up for me when it counted, she hadn't refused the honeymoon funds or confessed the fraud. Now she was lonely, and that was apparently reason enough for me to open my life, and my daughter's, to her. I erased the message and told Nathan I was done. True sisterhood would never have allowed her to watch me suffer without protest. The following week slipped into a beautiful, if exhausting, routine of caring for Eve. Each day, her eyes seemed to take in more of the world. Her tiny fists grasped my fingers tighter. Nathan learned how to cradle her just right so she'd drift off against his chest. At night, after she fell asleep, we'd collapse on the couch, arms around each other, marveling at this new chapter of our lives. Whenever the specter of my parents rose in my mind, I reminded myself that I was building a family centered on genuine love. Their attempt to intrude was like a faint siren in the distance, eerie, but ultimately powerless if I refused to open the door. A few months later, when Eve was about 6 months old, we received unexpected news from one of my uncles. My parents were selling their house. Supposedly, my father's accounting business had nearly flatlined, and they could no longer afford the mortgage. Mia, still living with them, had no steady job, so they were pooling resources to downsize into a small rental home. A bitter part of me wanted to see photos of them packing up, living rooms stripped of furniture, dusty boxes piled high with their illusions of grandeur. But mostly, I just felt a weight lift off my chest. Them moving away symbolically marked an end to the place where so many of my childhood wounds were inflicted. The house had always been a physical testament to their favoritism, Mia's immaculate bedroom, the way they never let me rearrange anything in mine. Now, it was gone. Uncle Jim, the one who'd shared the news, asked if I wanted to come by and retrieve any childhood items before they vacated the premises. I had stowed some old photo albums in the attic, a few notebooks of teenage poetry, but I shook my head. Let them do what they want with it, I said. I had no desire to step into that space again, not after the final blow they'd dealt me. Though part of me ached for the innocent 9-year-old I'd once been, flipping through my mother's wedding album at the kitchen table, I knew that child was long gone. In the quiet that followed, I found my mental health improving. My postpartum highs and lows were tempered by the knowledge that I'd done the right thing, protecting Eve from the toxicity that had defined my own upbringing. Nathan's unwavering support was my lighthouse. I took strolls through the neighborhood with Eve in her stroller, relishing the sunshine and the sound of leaves rustling overhead. Sometimes I'd bump into acquaintances from high school who still lived nearby, and they'd ask if I ever saw my parents. I'd simply smile and say, "No, I'm focused on my own family now." Most people seemed to understand, or at least respect, the boundary. As Eve approached her first birthday, I decided to throw a modest party in our backyard. A small gathering with close friends, Nathan's parents, and the relatives on my mother's side who had been supportive. On the morning of the party, I stood by the kitchen counter, placing fruit onto skewers and humming a lullaby under my breath. Eve was napping upstairs, and Nathan was outside setting up balloons. My phone pinged with a notification. An unfamiliar number had left a voicemail. A prickle of unease ran through me. I debated ignoring it, but some instinct urged me to listen. It was my mother's voice. "I know we've had our differences," she began, her tone subdued, "but I'm begging you. You can't cut us out of our granddaughter's life. This is tearing your father and me apart. We've lost so much. Please, we're so alone now." She started to cry, and then the message ended. Her words replayed in my head, but I felt no urge to call back. She spoke about their loneliness, their losses, never about the damage they did to me or the sincerity needed to mend it. Not once did she mention paying back a cent of the money they stole. Not once did she acknowledge the psychological trauma of that deceitful scheme. She was trying to manipulate me through guilt, but I'd wised up long ago. Still, I felt a pang of sorrow that day. As I strung up decorations, I recalled an alternate universe, one where my parents had been supportive, where Mia and I had been true sisters, and they could have been part of this celebration. But that universe had never existed. The actual reality was a twisted one, and they'd used that final, elaborate lie to fund Mia's lifestyle. That knowledge set the record straight. I had every right to celebrate my daughter's birthday with people who truly cared. The party turned out lovely. Eve, wearing a fluffy pastel dress, seemed enthralled by balloons and cupcakes. She babbled happily in my arms as Nathan's mother took pictures, capturing the sweetness of the day. My aunts and uncles gave small gifts, handmade blankets, storybooks, and a tiny pair of sneakers. After we sang happy birthday, I cradled Eve and blew out a single candle on her behalf. The applause and laughter brimming around us felt genuine. Not a single second was wasted on forced smiles or hidden resentments. It was a stark contrast to my own childhood celebrations, which were often overshadowed by Mia's demands. I blinked away tears of gratitude. Later that night, as we cleaned up wrapping paper and half-eaten slices of cake, I checked my phone again. 3 more missed calls from my parents' number. No new voicemails, just the insistent proof that they were still trying. I blocked the number without a second thought. I reminded myself that their remorse was incomplete, more desperation than true repentance. If they wanted to be part of my life or Eve's, they needed to admit their wrongdoing, return what they had stolen, and show they understood why I'd cut them off in the first place. None of that had happened. Instead, they'd tried threats, guilt, and tears, all while pretending they had some inherent right to see my child. It was maddening, but also strangely clarifying. Their continued attempts showed just how little they respected boundaries. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Eve started saying her first words, taking her first wobbly steps while holding onto the coffee table. Nathan and I documented every milestone, cheering her on with unbridled enthusiasm. We discovered new facets of parenthood, like the joy of seeing your child's eyes light up at small wonders, a bubble floating in the air, a new stuffed animal, a peekaboo game. Each time, I silently vowed never to let her feel second best in her own home. The scars from my childhood deepened my determination to be a different kind of parent. There would be no golden child, no scapegoat, just unconditional love. When Eve turned 18 months old, something unexpected happened. Mia showed up on our doorstep one rainy afternoon. My heart nearly stopped when I opened the door to see her standing there, drenched, no umbrella in hand. She looked pale, thinner than I remembered, her hair in disarray. My mind leapt to possible worst-case scenarios. Was she in danger? Did she need a place to stay? But I kept my guard up. She'd burned the bridge too thoroughly for me to blindly trust her. The only reason I didn't slam the door in her face was a basic sense of empathy. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Finally, she mumbled, "I needed to talk to you in person." Rain dripped off her jacket onto our porch. "Just 5 minutes," she pleaded. I glanced over my shoulder. Eve was in the living room, playing with blocks under Nathan's watchful eye. He was standing now, noticing the tense vibe, ready to intervene if necessary. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. The sound of raindrops on the gutters created an odd intimacy. Mia's eyes searched mine. For the first time in years, I saw genuine remorse on her face. Still, I waited for whatever she had to say. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracked. "I know you won't believe me, but I'm sorry for everything. For taking that money, for letting them lie to you, for not stopping it." Silence draped over us. My chest tightened as memories of her social media posts, her spa pictures, her enabling of our parents' scheme washed over me. I wanted to hurl accusations, demand she return every cent, demand to know why she let me suffer so long. But I simply waited. She continued, "Mom and Dad are, well, they're in a bad place. They keep telling me it's my fault that you cut them off, that I should fix it. She broke off, tears mixing with raindrops. I know I played my part. I was selfish, always took what they gave me. I never questioned it, but I'm trying to make things right now." I listened, my arms crossed. Part of me wanted to spit out a refusal, remind her that no apology could undo the betrayal. Another part of me, the part that remembered us giggling as kids over silly jokes, felt a pang of pity. But I'd grown cautious. "What do you want?" I asked softly. She hesitated. "I want to meet my niece. I want to see you. I want to start over." She swallowed. "I don't expect you to just let me in, but maybe we can talk more. Away from our parents." I breathed in the crisp, rain-soaked air. "I don't trust you," I said. The bluntness shocked even me, but it needed saying. "You never stood up for me, Mia. You let them manipulate me into giving up my wedding fund so you could have a fancy honeymoon. Then you boasted about it online." She lowered her head. "I know, I was wrapped up in my own bubble. I've lost a lot too, you know. My fiancé left, I have no real job prospects. Mom and Dad resent me now that their finances are wrecked. It's been a nightmare." I studied her face, searching for sincerity. She did look haggard, genuinely weighed down by regret. But I remembered how quickly she could shift blame. "Look," I said, trying to maintain composure, "even if you are sorry, it doesn't erase what happened, and it definitely doesn't mean you can pop up here and expect to meet my daughter." She nodded, tears still in her eyes. "I know it'll take time. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends." Her voice quivered with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Desperation, perhaps, or genuine contrition. "I'm not asking to come in. Just, if you ever feel ready to talk, or if you need anything, here's my new number." She placed a small piece of paper on the porch rail. "I'll go now." I watched her retreat into the rain, feeling a complex knot in my chest. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe her life had collapsed, and she was finally reckoning with the damage she'd done. Or maybe it was another manipulation tactic. Either way, I resolved not to let her heartbreak sway me too easily. Trust was earned through consistent, honest actions, not just words. When I told Nathan what happened, he listened calmly. "She might be sincere," he offered, "but you owe her nothing. If you choose to explore a relationship, do it on your terms." In the following weeks, my mind simmered with internal debates. Part of me wanted to burn that number and never look back. Another part whispered that perhaps this was my chance to salvage some sort of sibling connection, albeit carefully. Mia had arrived in the pouring rain, tearful and alone, bearing an apology I never expected to hear. Did it make a difference? I decided to sit on it. I neither called nor burned the paper. Instead, I tucked it into a drawer. I focused on my family, Nathan and Eve, and kept forging ahead. I'd survived too much heartbreak already. Mia could wait. If she truly wanted to make amends, time would test her resolve. Meanwhile, word reached me from Uncle Jim that my parents had indeed moved into a dingy rental home on the outskirts of our old neighborhood. They were struggling to maintain even that. My mother no longer worked as a teacher, and my father was picking up odd jobs to stay afloat. Rumor had it, they occasionally blamed me for their downfall, claiming that I'd slandered them and cost my father his clients. Every time I heard such updates, I just shrugged. They'd dug their grave. If they wanted to save themselves, the first step would be to accept responsibility for what they did and try to atone. Clearly, that hadn't happened. As Eve grew into a chattering toddler, life blossomed around her. She was fearless, climbing onto furniture, babbling words, and giggling at every new discovery. I cherished the ordinary miracles, her first mama, the way she'd reach up for me when she wanted a hug. I vowed she would never feel unloved or sidelined, and in the quiet hours of night, I sometimes found my thoughts drifting to Mia and the sincerity of her tears on that rainy porch. Maybe, just maybe, one day I'd give her a chance to prove herself. That day came unexpectedly. Nathan and I decided to attend a local fair with Eve, drawn by the promise of cotton candy, colorful rides, and music. While strolling through the crowds, I spotted Mia working a small booth for a local charity. She wore a volunteer badge, her hair pulled back. She looked tired but smiled politely at people passing by. Our eyes met. She froze, pamphlets clutched in her hand, clearly unsure if she should acknowledge me. My heart pounded. I could have walked away without a word, but something in her gaze reminded me of the younger sister I once knew, wide-eyed, uncertain, desperate for some sense of belonging. I approached, holding Eve's hand. "I didn't know you volunteered here," I said, attempting a neutral tone. Mia fumbled with the pamphlets. She murmured that it was something she'd started doing to get out of the house, to feel useful. She glanced at Eve, her eyes brimming with emotion. But she didn't try to touch her or speak to her directly. Instead, she just whispered, "She's beautiful. You're doing great, you know, being a mom." Nathan hovered protectively nearby, but he allowed me the space to handle the situation. I felt a strange mix of tension and compassion. Mia looked genuinely humbled, a far cry from her once entitled demeanor. After a few moments of awkward silence, I offered, "We're just walking around, seeing the sights. Are you off soon?" Her eyes lit with cautious hope. "In about 30 minutes. She hesitated. "Want to grab a coffee at the stand over there when I'm done? Just to talk?" I studied her face, searching for hidden motives, but all I found was sincere yearning. My mind flashed to that last conversation on my porch. Maybe this was the next step. Maybe I wanted to see if there was any substance behind her apology. "Okay," I answered. "We'll be by the carousel." When she finished her volunteer shift, she found us near the carousel, Eve perched on a decorative horse, squealing with delight while Nathan held her steady. Mia stood a few paces away, visibly trying not to interfere, her expression softening at my daughter's giggles. I could see tears threatening again, but she composed herself. I led the way to a coffee cart near the edge of the fairgrounds. There, the four of us, Nathan, me, Eve in a stroller, and Mia, sat at a small table. We made superficial small talk at first about the fair, the weather, the charity booth. Eventually, I cleared my throat. "If you're serious about making amends," I said, "I need to know that you understand how big your role in that betrayal was. You accepted that money, flaunted it, and never spoke up. You hurt me." Mia's eyes were wet. "I know, and I regret it every day. I told Mom and Dad they should pay you back, but they said they couldn't. Then they told me it wasn't my fault, but I know it is. I participated. I was spoiled. I was cruel. Nathan reached over to gently place a hand on mine, reminding me I wasn't alone in this. "Words are cheap," he said quietly, "especially after so long. Are you prepared to actually do something about it?" Mia nodded vigorously. "I'm trying to find better work so I can pay you back some portion of what you lost, or at least show you I mean it. I can't do much right now, but I can start somewhere." Her voice trembled. "I've also told Mom and Dad that I'm not going to stand with them unless they fix this. They think I'm betraying them, but I can't live like this anymore." I studied her, searching for signs of deceit. Her sincerity seemed real this time. Perhaps the downfall of our parents had forced her to confront harsh truths about herself. Maybe she recognized that the entitlement she enjoyed as the golden child had come at a devastating cost. Still, trust wasn't going to be rebuilt in a day. "I'm not making any promises," I said. "I can't say when, if ever, I'll let you be close to Eve. But if you truly want to make things right, show me, not just with words, but with consistent actions over time." Mia nodded, tears escaping down her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered. "Thank you for even talking to me." She gave Eve a longing look, but she didn't ask to hold her. I appreciated that subtle sign of respect for my boundaries. When we finished our coffees, I felt emotionally drained but oddly lighter, like I'd taken the first step on a new, uncertain path. Nathan and I left Mia at the fair, pushing Eve's stroller toward the parking lot. She waved a tentative goodbye, a small, watery smile on her face. As we got in the car, Nathan asked, "You okay?" I exhaled. "Yeah, I think so. I don't know where this will lead, but at least I said my piece." In the days that followed, Mia sent me a couple of text messages, brief and polite, updating me on job applications she'd submitted and how she was trying to gather some small savings to repay a fraction of what I'd lost. She didn't demand to see Eve, didn't push me to meet up again. She seemed to respect that I needed space. I found myself responding with cautious encouragement. "Thanks for letting me know. Good luck on your interview." It was surreal to have these measured, almost formal exchanges with the same sister who once reveled in my parents' favoritism. And yet, it felt like progress. Maybe not toward a full reconciliation, but at least toward a less toxic dynamic. All the while, I kept my guard firmly in place regarding my parents. Whatever went on in their new rental was their business. I had no intention of bridging the gap they'd created. They hadn't shown remorse. They hadn't reached out with any genuine apology or attempt to repay what they stole. And I knew them well enough to suspect they never would. My father's sense of entitlement, my mother's inclination for drama, and their unwavering loyalty to Mia's former illusions all pointed to one conclusion. They still believed they were victims of my ungratefulness. I refused to allow that poison near my daughter or my husband. On a warm afternoon, about a month after the fair, Mia texted again. "Got a job at a local office doing data entry. It's not glamorous, but it's stable. I'm going to send you a small check soon, just to start." I stared at the message, feeling a ripple of conflicting emotions. Part of me admired her effort. Another part remained skeptical, but I typed a short reply. "Congrats. It's a good first step." That was all I said, and that was enough for now. Trust builds slowly, if it builds at all. Maybe her real test would come when our parents demanded she funnel her new salary into their expenses. Would she stand her ground? Over the next few months, a steady drip of small checks arrived from Mia, each one for a modest amount, but with a note attached. Just to show I'm serious. True to my word, I banked each check, but didn't let it alter my stance immediately. I appreciated the gesture, but I needed to see her continue down this road. By Eve's second birthday, Mia had paid back a fraction of the $15,000 stolen, nowhere near the total, but more than I ever expected. She'd also maintained a respectful distance, never showing up unannounced, never pushing for more than I was willing to offer. Slowly, I felt my anger thaw, still present, but no longer all-consuming. She was making an honest effort to right her wrongs. My parents, on the other hand, remained silent apart from the occasional desperate email or blocked voicemail. On Eve's second birthday, we had another small celebration. This time, I invited Mia, but with conditions. It would be outdoors at a park, and she was to come alone. No mention of our parents, no drama. I watched her arrive, carrying a small wrapped gift. She greeted Eve with gentle excitement, though she didn't immediately try to scoop her up. She let Eve come to her. Eventually, Eve toddled over, attracted by the brightly colored wrapping paper. Mia lowered herself to the child's eye level and handed her the gift with trembling hands. Eve giggled and tore the paper, revealing a soft stuffed bunny. She gave it a big squeeze. Mia's eyes brimmed with tears, but she stayed composed. That moment felt like a fragile olive branch bridging our tumultuous past and a tentative future. I couldn't predict where we'd end up. Would we ever be as close as normal sisters might be? Perhaps not, but at least we were taking steps towards some measure of understanding. Later, while Eve played with the other kids, Mia came over and quietly said, "I really do want to be better. For you, for her, and for myself. I see now how warped our family dynamic was." I nodded. "I can see you're trying," I replied softly. "Keep doing it. Keep proving it. This isn't something we can fix overnight." She nodded, tears glistening. In that unspoken moment, we acknowledged how far we'd come and how far we had left to go. Nothing about our conversation erased the pain of the past, but it opened a door where before there had only been a wall. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself cautiously letting Mia into my life in increments. She'd drop by once every couple of weeks, usually bringing something small for Eve, a coloring book, a new puzzle, and she always checked with me first. Each visit, she offered another apology or insight into how she was trying to unravel her old thinking. If I detected even a hint of entitlement or manipulative behavior, I'd put up a boundary. But she never pushed back. She seemed determined to rebuild from the ground up. I wouldn't call it forgiveness yet. More like a slow thaw, a willingness to let her show who she could be without our parents' overshadowing influence. Nathan was watchful but supportive, and Eve was simply happy to have another adult fussing over her in healthy ways. Sometimes Mia would get this wistful look, and I suspected she was recalling the childhood bond we should have had. Occasionally, she'd speak about our parents with an air of quiet sorrow, but I told her that was a subject I didn't want to dwell on. She respected that. Perhaps the biggest milestone came when Mia handed me the largest check she'd managed so far, along with a letter. In the letter, she detailed her plan to pay back the full sum, eventually, even if it took years. She also offered an authentic, unflinching apology. No excuses, no blame shifting. She acknowledged the magnitude of the harm she'd caused and the trust she'd squandered. After reading it, I sobbed, releasing pent-up emotions I hadn't realized I still carried. In that moment, I felt the possibility of forgiveness, not because she demanded it, but because she was finally doing the work. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with Mia. We are far from a traditional family, but she is trying, and so am I, cautiously, carefully, in a way that doesn't jeopardize the peace I fought so hard to claim. My parents remain on the periphery, cut off by their own arrogance and lack of genuine repentance. Perhaps one day, in some distant future, they'll follow Mia's example and approach me with humility and honesty, offering more than crocodile tears. But I won't hold my breath. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that people rarely change without a crushing impetus forcing them to confront their demons. In the meantime, my life feels unexpectedly balanced. I wake each morning to Nathan's gentle smile and Eve's laughter. I've cultivated a circle of friends and supportive relatives who genuinely celebrate my successes and comfort me in my sorrows. My wedding photos still occupy a place of honor in our home, a reminder that I seized control of my happiness. When Mia visits, she sees them too, and I hope they remind her of the day I finally stood up for myself. She sometimes helps me cook dinner, entertains Eve with silly games, and leaves after a couple of hours, never overstaying her welcome. It's a delicate dance, but it's real. Yes, there's a way forward, one that doesn't erase the past or pretend the pain never existed, but acknowledges the wounds and strives to mend them, one small piece at a time. As for my parents, I have no regrets. Until they show the kind of remorse and accountability Mia has, my life will remain blissfully free of their manipulations. I have enough love, enough laughter, and enough peace within these walls to last me a lifetime. My sweet daughter will grow up cherished, free from the cycle of favoritism and betrayal that once defined my upbringing. That is my victory, and no matter how time unfolds, I will always hold on to the self-respect that kept me strong through the worst of it. they can keep their regrets. I've found my path and I'm walking it with my head held high.